Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large.
This is Ruth McLeod, the Southern Atheist.
This week we are actually going to just dive right into an interview that we have set up. I set this up. This is a very special guest that we have, actually. I'm very, very happy about this. We are going to be interviewing a man named Jon Atack, and he is in Nottingham, England.
You didn't have to do that.
I had to do that. I totally had to do that because I never get to do that. And you can see why. Anyway, so John's actually a friend of mine, and I met him in Toronto last year at the Getting Clear conference, which was a conference on Scientology, where we spoke for Scientology survivors and cult survivors and whatnot, spoke for a week about Scientology. And that video of that is actually up on Vimeo and available, if you're interested in that. But Jon has a long history with Scientology, but that's not actually what we're going to be talking about in our podcast here this week.
What?
Yeah. Like, if Scientology doesn't come up at all...
Sure you can't do that?
Yeah. Wow. Wow, it's like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
exactly like that.
That's exactly like that. So, if Scientology doesn't come up at all, that's actually okay. Yeah, it's actually okay. So we're going to be talking to Jon about his new endeavor and project and a new book that he just wrote. So first off, hey Jon.
Hi, good to see you.
Yes, good to see you. Welcome to our show. So could you first off, just for anybody on our show who is not familiar with you or your name or who you are, just give a little bit of background about yourself?
Can I do that without mentioning Scientology?
That's the challenge.
Might be difficult, huh?
For it,
I was a sort of not a live-in member of Scientology for 9 years, so I rose very high to the stunning level of OT5, from whence I could look down upon the mortals below me and play with my body thickness. And I somehow managed to do 9 years without being humiliated and abused. And I think I may be unique in that there may be somebody else out there who didn't get that treatment. But so I was fine when I left. And I'd been hypnotized, I'd handed over a certain amount of cash, but because I never worked within Scientology, there was a whole layer that was missing, and I didn't realize that I was meant to be scared. So I stood up and started talking about the abuses that were happening at the Central cult. That was way back in 1983 when L. Ron Hubbard still walked the earth.
Wow, 1983. This is like OG Scientology stuff here. This is like way back.
Yeah, back in the beginnings of prehistory.
That's right.
And I left and I stood up and I was harassed, and that somehow hardened my resolve. And I spent 12 years talking with members, with, about 500 ex-members during that time, helping them out if I could. Researching the background of Scientology, finding out what Ron Hubbard had really been up to. And contrary to popular opinion put about by Scientology, my teacher was not Jerry Armstrong. Jerry actually had very little to do with it because he was in his silence period while I was researching. He's a good friend though, bless him, and has done a great deal of good. That culminated in the book A Piece of Blue Sky, which we reissued with the missing passages a couple of years back, retitled Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which is a quote from Ron Hubbard on the day that he opened his first foundation to the public. He turned to the guy next to him and said, "Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky," which I think he pretty successfully did. I wrote various papers, I appeared at academic conferences, I became involved with a tremendous amount of media. I probably did about 200 media stories, 150 court cases that I acted on. Government agencies came to me and asked me questions. And I was harassed and harassed and harassed. I mean, Arnie Lerner, bless him, when I asked him for a puff for the new version of Blue Sky, said, before the internet and safety in numbers, there was Jon Atack, which is, it's not utterly true. There were a few other people. There was Lawrence Wollersheim, Jerry Armstrong, Bob Penny, Vaughan and Stacey Young. There were a few people along the way, but in the UK and Europe, there really weren't. And I got used to every day having people with placards, having people banging on my door, or, having people accost me in the street, having people break into my house, being followed by private detectives with guns whenever I went to the US. It was a kind of happy life. I think of it like a kind of John le Carré novel, but populated by the Marx Brothers, because I was so completely ineffectual for the most part.
Right.
So they get scared and they do the wrong thing and go the wrong way and land in trouble. At the end of that time, bankrupted, my health worn down to nothing, my marriage wrecked, my life in tatters after 12 years of this, I withdrew and just went, I really don't want to do this anymore. It's no fun.
And those big checks from Big Pharma stopped coming in at that point, or?
Yeah, Big Pharma, the CIA, all of them. I did at one point actually talk with Martin Sorrell, and I didn't know who he was. And at the time he was the head of WPP, which I'm told means Wire and Plastic Products. And he ran Joe Walter Thompson and Gilvian Mather and Hill and Knowlton. He was the man over them all. I had no idea who he was. And at that time, Eli Lilly were caught up in litigation. Eli Lilly and Hill and Knowlton were caught up. And I talked with Eli Lilly's people, and I'm sad to say that they didn't pay me. So,
they're stingy with those checks. I mean, I kept waiting for my check from Big Pharma. It hasn't shown up yet.
Yeah. Well, of course, Miscavige did deals with both Hill and Knowlton and Big Pharma, whereby he would no longer go after them ethically, as long as they didn't go after him. And, money was exchanged, I hear, but it's all a matter of, tech doesn't go in if you don't get ethics in, I'm told. So,
right.
Pretty obvious it didn't work on him. So what fascinated me during the last years of the 80s, I became more and more, I'd done the history of Scientology, I've done Hubbard, I'm the guy that put his records and, his journals and stuff like that. They came through me into the world. Because people would send me these damn things, and what are you going to do with them? You've got to give them to somebody else. And so I wasn't curious about Hubbard anymore. I pretty much knew he was a sociopath, probably, as Yuval Law says, with temporal lobe epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
So he's compelled to behave in the horrible way he behaved. To some extent, sociopathy is not, and paranoia and manic depression are not typical for temporal lobe epilepsy. You don't have to be a complete bastard to have that condition. Hubbard just happened to be a complete bastard as well. So I knew about him, I knew about Scientology, I knew enough to make a decision about that. What I didn't understand was how this stuff worked. How, I was seeing people, for me it was quite easy to walk away. I read books that were critical to Scientology, I read The Mind Benders, The Road to Freedom, for some reason when I was a member. I didn't realise I wasn't meant to, And so finding that there were people who couldn't even talk about it. If you challenged any of their assumptions about Ron Hubbard being, Maitreya or the Antichrist or whichever one he is, they would turn purple and start shouting. And the thing was that I found that this was the case with almost all ex-members, that they were very unwilling to consider information unless it related to a particular grievance. They were very happy to talk about Miscavige being a thug, or that kind of thing. But the idea that, Hubbard had been a pathological liar, or indeed that the whole of Scientology was a construction to hypnotize and enslave people, I found was not a very popular thought. And so pretty soon after I left the mother cult, I was being attacked by the independents as well, until they realized that I was a necessity for their legal defense from the mother cult when things quietened down rather quickly.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it?
Crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting because the people who come out still have the beliefs, are still damaged by it, And some of them are quite rabid dog about it.
Wow.
And I've encountered that myself.
And you find that it carries on for years. And even the people that, this is the thing that brought me back 3 years ago, realizing that there were people who 20, 30 years later, although they would publicly say that they disagreed with Scientology, still behaved in the way of Scientologists. You know, they still believed in suppressive people. They still disconnected when they got upset, you know, rather than talking things through. And they still followed the kind of silly, you know, dilution of the notion of karma that you find in Buddhism that is made into this trivial nonsense in Scientology, where, of course, you know, Scientologists think reincarnation, great thing, I'll be able to come back and do it again. You talk to anybody who has gone through the Brahminical, Hindu, or Buddhist stuff on karma, and they talk about the fear of the eternal return on the wheel of suffering. You know, so it's not, I'm a hippie, I'll be able to come back next lifetime and conquer this. You know, I'll just drop my body. You know, they have a slightly more serious perspective on this. But I became fascinated by the thought reform.
Right. That's what I have found to be the most interesting aspect of coming out and studying all this stuff, is learning all the various techniques and things that are done to people, you know, in destructive cults in general, not just Scientology. It's been fascinating.
And Scientology does stand out. I mean, I was about the only ex-Scientologist in the countercult world internationally for some years. There were people who opposed Scientology, like Lawrence and Jerry, but to actually engage fully with the countercult world, I think maybe the Whitfields, Anna and Jerry over there, I can't really think of anybody offhand in a 12-year period who engaged. I did. I talked with people in Cannes, with people in the AFF, which is now ICSA, and you know, people over here in various groups.
ICSA being the International Cultic Studies Association. Yeah,
that's it. It used to be the American Family Foundation, and it is essentially an academic group reaching out to help cult members. They have very good resources online, and you know, some very good papers and publications have come out from there. But often I hear the same thing. I remember talking to Priscilla Coates in Cannes in LA, the Cult Awareness Network, before it was taken over by Scientology. It's now an aspect of Scientology, of course, the Scientology Awareness Network.
Right.
I remember Priscilla saying, you know, we list 2,000 destructive cults, and I'll deal with any one of them but Scientology. And I found that again and again, Scientology was considered more invasive and more dangerous than any other group. And in simple terms, that's just because of how much is going on. If you go to Transcendental Meditation, they've got two techniques. You know, sitting and repeating the name of demon is one of them, though you're not meant to know it's a demon. And it's not necessarily a demon. It might not be a demon. I may be being unfair here, but often it is. Your secret word is an invocation of a demon. Let's just pause about that thought for a moment. Transcendental meditation. Their other technique is jumping up and down until you fracture your coccyx in the hope that you'll learn how to levitate. And I did indeed interview somebody who had fractured her coccyx doing this, so you know, which is an extraordinarily painful thing to do, and will stay with you for the rest of your life, I'm afraid. But they've got two techniques. Scientology, as you know, Chris, has over 2,000.
Yes.
And they will get you any way they can. And you'll go through cognitive restructuring. You will perceive the world and interpret the world in a quite different way as you're gradually remodeled to be cloned into good run or bad run. Those are the two options you have in Scientology. SEAL people, as they get higher up, clone into bad run. The particular thing is the severe reality adjustment. You know, this screaming fit 1 inch away from your face to utterly humiliate, abash, and destroy you. I only saw one of those, and it was a guy I'd employed who did it to my wife. And it was amazing. 9 years in, I'd never seen this behavior. I didn't know about it, and it was taking place every day in Silk. That's right. How, you know, the curtain that Wizard of Oz draws, you know, keeps the public out. Perhaps the more surprising, because I am a very friendly sort of person, so I spent a lot of time talking with SEAL members who never told me about rice and beans diets, never told me about, not speaking unless you're spoke, all of the horrors that are part of the normal thought reform system, the daily practice of Scientology. So when I first saw a severe reality adjustment, I kind of reacted badly and sat the guy down. It did take me a couple of days because he'd been a very senior member of the SEAL. Then I sat down eventually and went, why did you do that? And he burst into tears. And I'd expected him to send me to ethics or something for days. I said, well, where's it written that you do that? Because if it isn't written, it isn't true, as Ron said. And the guy said, oh, no, it's not written down anywhere. I said, well, why are you doing it? He said, because Ron did it to us. We learned it face to face. So Hubbard's thing is about reducing trauma with auditing and inflicting trauma by his presence. Add to that, he's an inch away from your face and all of his teeth are rotten. It wasn't just being shouted at. There was a fog of bad breath around this man at all times.
It's true. It's these little things that just, you kind of miss the stuff, but it's funny, yeah, that how it's run down. Anyway.
So I read, I think it was Information Disease by Conway and Siegelman, and then their book Snapping. I read Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, and had the good fortune to become friends with him pretty soon after that was published, around about 1989.
Yeah.
I talked with my, guys, my closest friend now, Christian Sherko, who you also met at Toronto, who I consider the great expert on, mediating and bringing people back together. He is really quite remarkable. And from there, it was just sort of, and I then went and read Lifton, and as we all have to at some point in our lives. And
it's kind of unavoidable. When you get into this, you're going to run into Lifton. Robert J. Lifton was a psychologist and a psychiatrist who did no, I'm sorry, but he did the original, what's considered the original groundbreaking work on cult studies.
Okay.
And that was in the 60s and 70s, right?
Thought reform in modern China in the 60s.
Yeah.
And since then has, produced the Nazi doctors and Destroying the World to Save It about Aum Shinrikyo, which is just a remarkable book. You find out, that we've got enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people, and had it not been for a guard on the Tokyo Railway, they would have wiped out thousands. But this guy saw what was happening, and we were lucky. But they're fantastic because their idea is a Buddhist idea, the idea of power, which is that you inflict people's bad karma upon them so they'll have a good rebirth. So they were going to murder all the Japanese people so they'd be happy.
Isn't that amazing? Did you hear about that?
No.
There was what he's referring to is an incident that happened. What year was that?
It was in the 80s.
Yeah, where a cult in Japan got a bunch of sarin gas, and they were going to release it in the subway system, in the metro system. And he's referring here to a guard who had a heads up, saw what was happening, and prevented it from occurring.
Wow.
And the reasoning for that was they were going to help all these people by inflicting their bad karma on those people, right, by forcing them to experience their bad karma. They were going to release them so that next time around, everything would be lovely for them.
Okay.
And this was a whole Japanese cult. This had nothing to do with Scientology. This was a whole different thing. Yeah.
It's actually bigger now than it was then. It's in Russia. And although Asahara, the leader, is in prison, the cult has a massive followers. So,
Jesus, it's like Warren Jeff's thing. The guy goes to prison, and they still run it from inside.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's scary stuff, and it really prompts you to want to do something about it when you learn about these techniques and you learn about what these guys are up to. At least me.
Yeah, and I think it's an incredibly significant area which has very few people actually functioning in it. And I, I don't particularly want to be a messiah, but I do get messianic about this because I've been involved with the environmental movement for over 30 years at a distance because I'm not very keen on joining things for some reason. If a friend like that before,
What?
Yeah.
What? Why? I don't get it.
I resigned I was given a membership to the Friends of the Earth. It was like, yeah, well, thank you very much, but I'm not doing that. So, I believe very much in reducing and reusing and recycling and all of that stuff. And I'm not entirely sure about the dangers and perils of carbon dioxide, but as we're pumping so much pollution out with it, I think we really ought to be a bit more careful. But the problem is that as long as we keep fighting wars, that's going to be a waste of time, because if you keep spraying the environment with depleted uranium and white phosphorus and the various things that are being used in warfare now and devastating environments, we're not really going to recover them. And so that gives us the fundamental human problem, which is that we fight wars. And it's incredibly stupid, incredibly unproductive. The only advantage is it develops the technology of weapons rather rapidly, which, if you like guns, is probably quite good. I'm not that keen on them. If you're going to stop people from fighting wars, there is only one way to go, and that is to teach them to think for themselves. And I'm not sure we can make that happen to everyone, but the more people who think for themselves, the more people, when the second Iraq conflict started in Britain, we had 1 million people on the streets saying no. We don't want to go out there. Not in my name was the campaign.
Wow.
And this amazing thought that to bring democracy to a country that had actually elected its mad leader, to bring democracy to this country, we were going to go against the democratic will of our own people.
Right.
Now, in the US, there was a lot more rah-rah and a lot more support for it. Here, there was 80% of the people didn't want it to happen. Now, I want to see the tipping point where there are enough people standing up and saying, hang on, let's talk this through, let's sort this out, we don't have to blow anybody up.
Right.
Well, the problem here in the States is that it's almost considered unpatriotic if we oppose a military conflict.
Yeah.
And so we're not going to have the riots in the streets until that ideology is changed within us.
That's right.
Exactly, and that's where we have to go to look at, helping people to think more critically, more rationally, and not to be
Critical
hooked
thinking.
on. Exactly, not to be hooked on this emotional thing.
Yes.
Samuel Johnson said the patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. And I think it was because he was actually annoyed with this bloke who wanted to say something nasty about this guy, John Bull. But nonetheless, there is this thing of, people become allied to their nation as if it was a real entity,
Right.
as if it had a real existence rather than only a conceptual and abstract existence.
Right.
And there was a movie many years ago called King and Country with Dirk Bogarde about the First World War. And this young soldier who's going, look, I did it for king and country. And it's sort of, well, what? You and your mates have all been murdered for no reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it's not that I do believe that, I'm not an utter pacifist. I believe that we have the right to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
I don't personally keep an assault rifle to do that, because in my country we're not allowed to, because we're
I was about to say, I don't think you can.
Right.
Freedom.
Seeing what's happened in Iraq and the thousands of soldiers returning with post-traumatic stress disorder, feeding that back into the culture again because nobody's looking after them. And that too has played a part. Because after the Falklands War in, 82, I leave Scientology and I'm suddenly meeting these people who are treating post-traumatic stress disorder. So I met the head of the Royal Navy, Morgan O'Connell, I've had the privilege of talking with many people who have a particular angle on undue influence, exploitative persuasion, brainwashing, call it what we will. A forensic psychologist I met along the way who talked to me about white-collar crime and said, well, actually, these people don't start out as criminals, the people I interview. What happens is the boss comes along, and you've got a lawyer or something, the boss comes along and he says, oh, we were meant to have this contract signed yesterday. Do you mind actually backdating it? And there'd be some tiny little step, and then the increase would increase. And so meeting him and talking with him was, yeah, okay, I see how that works. You get somebody to do something small, and then you put it up.
That's right.
It's like your con man who borrows $10 from you and gives it back to you with $5 interest the next day and some flowers, so that he can hit you up for $1,000 next week. The longer term game.
Right.
And I started to see that after I published Blue Sky in 1990, I really didn't want any more to do with Scientology. I wanted to understand how we'd become so devoted. I mean, I was a true believer. I'm not going to make any bones of that. During the 9 years I was involved in Scientology, I don't think there was a single moment when I questioned its veracity. I thought it really was this thing. I never quite thought that you were going to become enlightened, and I held on to my Buddhist idea, and I thought, well, the bridge will go so far and then you have to jump off it, because I couldn't quite see how you could use an assembly line to bring about individuality. And of course, the further when I got into the OT levels, I'd been involved for 7 years by then, and you're kind of committed, and you're seeing this ridiculous nonsense and going, that looks like ridiculous nonsense.
So now, clearly, that interest in Scientology and the experience in Scientology and everything we've been talking about has led you now to kind of a new endeavor, a new project you're working on. What's that about?
Well, again, this began back in 91. I quite simply, when Scientology is a microcosm of human behavior, there's nothing different about it, but dealt with members of a number of other groups and read a great deal about those groups and their founders. Sun Myung Moon, Rajneesh, Osho, the Buddha, Ron Hubbard, they're incredibly similar characters. And so it was like, okay, I became more interested in our response. I mean, a lot of the counter-cult movement is about how this is done to you, which is fascinating. But my question was, why do we respond to this? And as I see it, you need to understand both things. Because if you understand, so you go to Milgram, Zimbardo, Solomon Asch, Jane Elliott, the people who've done the psychology that explains fundamental aspects of human behavior, like cognitive dissonance, something that we all come back to frequently, Len Festinger's work. I started wanting to integrate that work in some way that would make it more accessible, because even though all of the names I've just mentioned are a psychology course in the English-speaking world, nobody really seems to be applying these things. So if you look at Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, and you then look at what happened at Abu Ghraib, it was the military psychologists all knew this was going to happen. And indeed, after it happened, they became involved and said, how did anybody let this happen? And it's sort of, not taking into account those things in our education, in our training. So in 1991, I outlined a series of 4 TV documentaries that I was completely unable to sell to anybody, which were an attempt to investigate everything from hypnosis through to totalist cults. I became interested in what is now being called radicalization. In fact, before 9/11, I was already looking at suicide bombers and going, well, they're the same dynamics. What's happening here, the social compliance, the way of moving people into a situation is the same wherever I look. So I looked at gangs. I've since looked a little bit at human trafficking. And I kept trying to sell this idea to various people in the counter-cult field who were all in the same situation. They were all saying, we're snowed under with the work we've got. You know, if there were 100 more people doing this, there still wouldn't be, 100 to 1 for all of us out here, there still wouldn't be enough people. Because in the US, you probably have 25 to 30 million people who are involved in some kind of totalist relationship, whether it's coercive control with a spouse or a human trafficker. It may even be more, or a totalist cult group. And then it's kind of endemic. It goes through our institutions. So I started trying to understand that. I kept trying to understand that. I met my friends with Jolly West, who was considered to be the most evil person in the world by Scientology.
Oh, they hate that guy. Hate him.
One of the most charming people I've ever met.
Mm-hmm.
And just super intelligent, just wonderfully intelligent. And
he was a researcher and psychiatrist or psychologist at UCLA, right?
He was the head of neuropsychiatry and biobehavior at UCLA.
Yeah.
Before that, he had worked for the intelligence agencies, it's true. Though from my conversations with him, he was largely trying to stop them from doing what they were doing. From the early 50s, he was called on by government agencies that were doing psychic research. The spoon vendors of the 70s, Uri Geller and co., that was 20 years after the first attempt by the US government to bring psychics in. And he told me this great story about he was told that he got to fly somewhere to see this amazing Indian guy who could cycle blind. He could actually ride a bike with his eyes covered in bread dough and bandages over his eyes. And Jolly said to me, he said, I was really busy, so I didn't want to fly out there. So I said, could you send me film of him? So they sent him film, and he was able to explain to them what the guy did, if they looked carefully at the film, is when they put the bread dough on his eyes, he put his fingers up like this. And then he rode like this.
Right. Right.
Very
Yeah. Anyway, I just want people to know who Jolly West was, because he's not a name people are generally going to recognize very easily.
His fame in Scientology was that there's a picture of him with a dead elephant.
Right.
He's standing on dead elephant's head, and he'd given LSD to it. So this was in the 50s.
That's right. The only man to have ever killed an elephant with LSD.
I heard about that.
Yeah, no, he actually did it. It was an experiment, and it was, stuff that was done in investigating psychedelics and stuff, and this was back in the 50s and 60s. But that was the one line, a thought-stopping cliche with Jolly West was, oh, Jolly West, you can just write off everything about him because he's the one man who, he's the only man who ever killed an elephant with LSD, and everybody just goes eye roll and, oh, that guy, he's crazy. Okay. That was it.
And they also found that if you go...
It does sound crazy.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. That's the whole point.
They also found that if you gave it to spiders, they make perfectly symmetrical webs. But these are early days, And he did violence studies, he did drug studies. He was the guy who discovered demotivation among cannabis users. He was the first person to write about the demotivation that people who use large quantities of cannabis tend to suffer. He was a very open, liberal and compassionate man. And I found our conversations very useful. I met Margaret Singer as well, who was just absolutely wonderful. And I just kept on trying to get this work out somewhere. And there wasn't anybody, listening. I don't have any academic background. I left school when I was 17. I did a couple of years in art college to avoid Scientology. And so I don't have any of the certificates to do this. I'd be at academic conferences and professors would sign papers saying how good my work was. Indeed, 40 professors and scholars signed a thing protesting Scientology's criticism of my work. But I had no authority. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I Steve Hassan was over, and I again sold my standard pitch, and he went away and he found this wonderful man called Dick Kelly. And Dick grew up as a child in the Jehovah's Witnesses. I think his mum took him in when he was 4. When he was 20, he decided he wanted nothing to do with it anymore. But his wife was still involved and remained involved, I think, for 25 years until she decided she didn't want to do it. After he retired, having run a very successful business, decided he wanted to do something about the Watched Out Society of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he works with AAWA, which you can find online, against the Watchtower abusers. And he came over with Steve, and we met. There was a little work that Steve was doing, and we met and talked, and he took the idea. He said, yeah, this is a great idea. We pulled together various people. We now have about 150, some ex-members, some experts. We have Steve Hassan, we have Christian Shelton, and some academics. Professor Jim Beverley, who was with us at Toronto, was taking him onto our board. And the idea is really to cross-pollinate the fields. So I'm talking with an expert in parental alienation at the moment, who's a psychiatrist whose job has been to bring back adult children to a parent who's been, shunned, and finding out that, often there are situations where the other parent has actually manipulated the children into believing certain things about the absent parent.
That's right. In fact, in the United States, I don't know about in England, but in the United States, that's actually illegal now to do that. It's called alienation. When you have separated or divorced parents, and one is creating a situation of, I'm told. I talked to Rachel Bernstein about this, and she was telling me that it's actually like you can get in trouble for that.
Yeah, I mean, the guy I was talking to here, we have no legislation to cover that. And he was saying that he reckons it happens in about 1 out of 5 cases. It is really prevalent.
Yeah.
And in that case, it's a matter of actually teaching people how much damage they're going to do to their children. So my thought is our thought. We had a meeting about a year ago, and we figured that with most of the endeavours that have tried to do something about this, there's been a problem because they've been started by experts, people like me, who have some knowledge, who have no clue how to run a business. Went to my brother Jim, who's a very successful businessman, and we have Dick Kelly, who's a very successful businessman, and Patrick Haig, and they deal with that part of it. My job is to, what we'd like to be doing is funding research. If we're setting up as a charity, as a non-profit, and we want to be able to actually fund psychological research, because although there's a great deal of research on social psychology, there's very little that's specific to membership of totalist cults. Paul Martin and Rod Debra Marshall did a very interesting study on over 500 ex-cult members, which pretty much demonstrated if you've been involved in one of these groups, it will have messed you up, when compared to the normal population. Nobody had done that before. You had Flavio Yakeley in his study at the Boston Church of Christ showing that all the members had the same personality, which was he hadn't anticipated.
Wow.
In his survey, he did, I think, 30 Scientologists, Marantha, the Way International, and was it the Krishnas or the Moonies? And he also did mainline Christian communities, and he found that you got all 16 personality types in an ordinary Christian church, but you would get one personality type each in the different cults. It would be different from one group to another, and he came up with the term cloning. We would like to see that kind of research done. We'd like to understand more about this problem. We would like to bring together experts from different fields. As I said, I'm very interested in terrorism and radicalization. And lots of the elements in that are social compliance. If you're a Palestinian and you grew up in a situation there, then the resentment is part of your culture. So it's not simply a matter of somebody on the outside, using some manipulative technique. If you look at suicide bombers, then you'll find there are probably two quite distinct routes. One of them, if you were born into a culture that feels itself oppressed, then you are taught. So in Palestine, toddlers of 2 years old are taken to photographers where they put on a mock suicide belt and have their photograph taken. And that's a quite normal aspect of Palestinian culture at the moment. If you are a shaheed or martyr, it used to be that Saddam Hussein would give you $25,000 if you blew yourself up, bless him, and your picture would be on billboards. You'd be a hero. School children in Palestine are taught that becoming a shaheed is a great honor, and the religious culture supports it, the educational culture supports it. So in that situation, you're not actually seeing any brainwashing. You're not really seeing much in the way of thought reform. I came upon a case, a guy called Omar Khan Sharif, who was born in the UK, in Derby, about 30 miles away from where I am, into a wealthy family which was pretty moderate in its Islamic belief. And he was radicalized, this other route where he was very specifically, his way of thinking about the world and perceiving the world and interpreting the world was changed. And you have to look at the whole relationship. To what extent does our society make us do stupid things because they're written into the way we behave? So we become patriotic instead of being concerned about justice. Yeah? Mm-hmm. The first Iraq War, I was in the US, and it really scared me. We went into a shop to buy something. The guy behind the counter said, "What do you think about these people in Iraq?" And I wasn't quite sure.
Very nice.
Thank you. We work on these things. A lot of practice goes into it. And luckily I had a journalist friend with me who was a lot quicker witted than I was, and he said something neutral. And the guy behind the counter said, "I think we should bomb those fuckers flat."
Sounds about right. I'm guessing Texas.
And it was like, well, I know he was from there. It was actually in Bishop, California.
Well.
Flat, somewhere. And I didn't know what to say. The first thing that came to my head was, what do you know about Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization? But I thought that probably wouldn't be appropriate, and he'd got a shotgun on the wall behind,
Yeah.
That was not going to win you there, no.
That way of enslaving people's minds, so they don't stop and think. So the emotion is what drives them, rather than, stopping and thinking. So this all led me to try and squeeze it into a little 200-page manual, which is called Opening Minds. You'll see that there's a slight overlap there between the name of the foundation and the title. That's a complete coincidence, by the way. And
sure.
I wanted to just get into the, how does this work, what's going on, and to explain a little bit more based upon the science, what we do understand, which is actually quite a lot. I think a particular area that fascinated me the most is brain science. Somebody who thinks that one of their limbs doesn't belong to them, so they try and throw it out of the bed to get rid of it. People are paralyzed who won't accept that one of their arms is paralyzed, so if you offer them a tray, they'll drop it and blame you. people who can only see the left side of what's in front of them, and indeed people who mistake their wives for hats, that it's not madness. They're not crazy. There's a part of the brain that's no longer functioning properly, and they have this syndrome. I mean, Korsakoff's is another one where common among alcoholics, and it's a vitamin B deficiency. And what happens is your memory stops working. You stop recording new memories. So you can remember everything up to a certain day, but from then on and for 20 or 30 years beyond, you will form no new memories. So when you see your own family, you'll kind of look at them and go, that's my brother. Why is he suddenly old? And every time you see him, when the doctor goes out of the room, you'll forget him and he comes back in and has to introduce himself. So I got very interested in that and the extent to which our way of seeing the world and interpreting the world is actually preventing us from seeing reality. And the ways in which, the great showman, Harry Houdini, we had Harry Price here in the interwar period. We now have Derren Brown, who I think is just magnificent. He's done a lot more work than I have to expose this stuff to the world, and he's been very successful. The problem is we tend to compartmentalise. So people can see that this happens to others.
But that never happens to me.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I'm never fooled by anything or anybody. I'm smarter than that.
Yeah.
Oh my God, the number of commenters I get sometimes, I just, they're so gullible, they're so stupid, those stupid people, I'd never fall for that,
And you know that they're the easiest people.
Exactly, those are the guys I would say, I wanted them to be the first in line for me to, proselytize to them when I was in Scientology. It was like, oh, you come to the head of the line. I want to talk to you.
Yeah. Exactly. The myth, the cloak of invulnerability.
Yes.
I interviewed a guy who'd been on the watchdog committee, the 14 people ruling Scientology at the end in 81, towards the end of Hubbard's life. And he was this wonderful 19-year-old. Of course, they were young, the people running it. I sat down with him. I interviewed him over 2 nights. Incredibly helpful. I found a great deal of stuff. At the end of it, he said, the wonderful thing is, John, that we'll never be conned again. And I just had to stop and say, no, the wonderful thing is I know I'm pretty gullible, and it makes it a bit cautious,
Exactly. That would be a healthy dose of humility would be the proper lesson from that experience.
Yeah, and I do think that humility is probably the greatest human virtue. We will use the full weight of our intelligence to support our stupidity. Whenever we make a mistake, we'll justify it, rather than just fessing up and learning something.
Exactly. So we're getting short on time. So I want to, and I can literally talk to you all afternoon. So I want to find out what is. What are your plans moving forward with the Open Minds Foundation, and what do you want people to know about that, right away?
My first concern is to bring people who are interested in the subject into one location where we can talk with each other. One of the things I have understood about the whole problem of totalitarianism, totalism, bullying, tyranny, is that it's tyrannical. There's a despot, a little martinet, a demagogue who, makes the rules. That is not my position. My position is very much that we all have something to contribute, and I don't have conversations with anybody where I don't learn something. That is my experience of life. And that's great. So we want a consensus. We don't want to create yet another little authoritarian pyramid. Frankly, I hope that we'll be able to gather enough people so that I'll be able to retire very soon. Sadly, I've made the mistake of not having any salary from this. So, which I keep doing that. It's like I won, I think it was $14 million in payments to people with Scientology, and I forgot to charge them most of the time. You know.
Right.
And then, of course, you get ripped to pieces on ESMB and where have you, for all the profit you make. I had somebody come to the bunker and say, he's just doing this to sell his book. And it's like, yeah, I sold a copy of the book this week and made $5, and I've just done another $300, free
I
piece
know,
of
if
journalism.
people only knew. I mean, nobody is getting rich in the counter-cult culture, I can tell you that. No one.
No, it never has been, it never will be.
No.
And it probably shouldn't be either.
Well,
But-
it actually, I mean, I tell you, if it really does put some truth to that statement, though, that, if you or I actually wanted to get rich, we would just go start a religion.
Oh. No, my significant other says that literally weekly to me.
Yeah.
He's like, why can't I be such a bad person that I can go out and do this? But no, I have to have a conscience. Damn
Exactly. Damn that conscience.
Stupid conscience.
If you'd like to give me some money, I'm sure we could erase it,
Yeah, sure.
It's obviously not useful to him, having this conscience. So we could do some Dianetics. I'm sure we could, it's probably just a service facsimile, isn't it?
Oh,
it's just
sure, that's
making
exactly what
it
it
wrong.
is. Yeah.
They're not taking their money from them.
Right.
And if you take the Christian perspective, rich people can't go to heaven, so we ought to take their money from them.
Depends on which interpretation of a Bible that you're talking about.
Yeah.
If you're going to go the Christian route to it,
Christian route, yeah.
there's two different passages in there. One of them says that it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
There's also another one that says take pride in the things that you have, which basically, I mean,
So if you have money, then...
I'm almost positive I said that one incorrectly, but it essentially says, be thankful in the things that you have, and, to acquire more is to be able to help more, and so...
But Jesus himself was a bit specific, wasn't he? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, chasing the money changers out of the temple and saying quite specifically, if you would follow me, you must give all you have to the poor. So any Christian I meet, I say, have you given everything to the poor? Because that's the first step.
Yeah.
Right, there you go.
Well, that's just made me very popular, I'm sure.
Oh, yes, I'm sure.
Yeah, you should see some preacher houses out here.
Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah, I mean, people like Benny Hinn, they're just disgusting. They're an abomination.
Yeah.
Tax-free, too, by the way.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah.
So what we'd like to do is gather together the people who know about it, get the information out there. I mean, in everywhere and anywhere, and we're open to suggestions from anybody as to how we can better do this. I mean, there's a campaign, there's a wonderful friend of mine called Ira Chaloff, and he last year wrote my book of the year, which was called Intelligent Disobedience. Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist, heard about this book, read it, and he's written a foreword to it saying, I spent my whole career trying to find out what this man has discovered. So, you don't get much more than that. Now, Ira is now doing a little campaign for 5-year-olds on the internet to teach them in a moment how not to give in when somebody says, you've got to do this. And it's the Blink Think campaign, which will show them how to resist being obedient. How, when they're asked to do something that doesn't seem right to them, they can stop and say, I don't want to do that. I want to see mummy, I want to see the teacher, whatever. Just to build a little resistance. Because I think the problem that is leading us into totalitarianism is obedience. It's this, Oscar Wilde said that disobedience was man's original virtue. The way that Ira is putting it forward is, it was guide dogs for the blind, which is where this expression intelligent disobedience comes from. that a dog has to be able to say to its owner, no, you're going to walk into something if I do what you've asked me. So it's okay for us to teach guide dogs to disobey when it's relevant, but we don't teach our children. Well, I teach mine, and they don't obey me, which is a bit difficult. But
I was about to say there.
teachers are being trained to, in thought reform techniques, which are, so we become inured to this kind of behaviour. So we'd like to make little videos, we'd like to do seminars on counselling, take people from different disciplines and put them together, film those things and put them out for free on YouTube. Actually reach a vast audience without having to go through governments and educational authorities and material out there, and some people will want it and will use it.
Excellent. Okay, good. Well, that is certainly a worthy endeavor there, definitely, and one that should be supported, and I'm sure you and I will be talking more about this as well. So,
I'm sure.
So good stuff. Well, the book that you wrote, Opening Minds, that's available on Amazon and anywhere else?
At the moment, we've released it just on Kindle, with the thought that, people can contact me if there's anything that needs to be added. We already will need to add something in the field of coercive control and domestic violence, because I'm now talking with people who know about it, so I can write a few paragraphs about that. But the hope is to have a print version within the next few weeks.
Okay, great. Good. Well, so check that out. And you're also forming up a website for this group?
Yes, we hope, in fact, by the time you broadcast, we hope to have the website up. Because we've gone a professional route, that the thought is to get the business and the experts functioning properly. We've employed a PR agency so that we'll have a good-looking website and can hopefully have some reach into the media through that as well.
Excellent. Good. Okay, folks, so you can check those things out. Jon, thank you very much for being part of this. We really appreciate you taking the time, and I know this is informative stuff.
Yeah.
I am fascinated by this. So thank you again.
Okay, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you both.
Excellent.
Thank
Talk
you.
to you.
Well, internet problems to the side. I will have some editing work there, but I find this stuff fascinating because I think it is. I think that this kind of work is broadly embracive to sociology,
Yes.
right? Psychology and culture,
Yes.
right? This is not just a niche field,
And I just personally find it interesting that people who come out of cults have a tendency to look at the whole mind control or the psychological implications of a cult, whereas people who come out of a traditional religion like mine, we kind of tend to seek out other religions for a while until we eventually either find something that works or we just go, F it, I'm just going to do my own thing.
right?
So whenever I speak to someone who is ex-Scientology, ex-JW, ex-Mormon, ex any kind of religion, destructive or not, or not religion, I'm sorry, cults, destructive or not, they tend to seek out the psychology of how they got into that.
That's right.
Right. Whereas people like me tend to go, baby Jesus, that wasn't weird at all, the whole talking snakes, burning bushes. No. That's normal. It's just I don't really buy it anymore. But it's not weird. It's just what I knew. And so we don't really look into the psychology of it. So I think this was a really important conversation that we needed to have. And I think more people need to have.
Yeah, excellent. Cool. All right. And so with that, we're going to be wrapping up our show.
Yeah.
So Any comments, any feedback, any originations, anything you guys want to say about this? Pro, for, against, whatever. Put it in the comments section below. And
I can point now like everybody else on YouTube.
That's right. And otherwise, you can email us, Chris at sensiblyspeaking.com.
Or Ruth at sensiblyspeaking.com.
All right, guys. Thanks for coming around, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, y'all.